The morning sun cast golden rays across the Sea of Galilee, bathing the small fishing village of Capernaum in warm light. The day promised to be scorching, as was typical during the dry season, but the villagers were already bustling about their morning chores. Fishermen mended their nets by the shore. Merchants set up their stalls in the marketplace, and women gathered at the well, sharing stories and laughter as they collected water for the day. In a small mud brick house on the outskirts of the village lived 8-year-old Nathaniel, a boy whose bright eyes and quick mind were trapped in a body that had betrayed him. 3 years earlier, a terrible fever had ravaged his small frame, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Now he spent his days on a thin mat near the window, watching other children play games he could only dream of joining. "Mother," Nathaniel called out, his voice carrying the innocence of childhood despite the suffering he had endured. "Is today the day the prophet comes to our village?" Leah, Nathaniel's mother, looked up from the bread she was kneading. Flour dusted her hands, and forearms and a few strands of hair had escaped from beneath her head covering. Worry lines had etched themselves permanently around her eyes since her son's illness, but when she smiled at him now, her face radiated with love. "Yes, my precious one. They say Jesus of Nazareth is traveling this way today. Perhaps." Her voice trailed off, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. Nathaniel's father, Eli, a stonemason with hands roughened by years of labor, entered the small dwelling. The weight of his son's condition had bent his shoulders more than any stone he had ever carried. "I've heard stories," Eli said cautiously, placing a calloused hand on his wife's shoulder. "They say this Jesus has healed the sick, made the blind, and even cast out demons. But Capernaum is just another village. Why would he stop for us? For our son?" Leah's eyes flashed with sudden determination. "Why not our son? Is our Nathaniel's suffering less worthy of mercy than others? I will find this Jesus myself if I must." Nathaniel watched his parents with wisdom beyond his years. He had seen how his condition had drained their resources, how his mother stayed awake through countless nights when his legs spasmed in pain, how his father worked double shifts to pay for physicians who offered no cure, only temporary relief. "Perhaps God has forgotten us," Eli muttered, the words escaping before he could hold them back. "No, Father," Nathaniel said softly, his faith untarnished by years of disappointment. "The rabbi says God never forgets his children. He counts every tear." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Excited voices filled the street, growing louder by the moment. Their neighbor, an elderly widow named Ruth, burst through their doorway without knocking, her eyes wide with excitement.
"He's here, the prophet from Nazareth, the one they call Jesus. He's teaching by the shore and the crowds are gathering. They say he speaks with authority unlike the scribes and Pharisees. People from all around are bringing their sick to be
healed." Eli and Leah exchanged a look that contained years of shared hope and disappointment. It was Nathaniel who broke the silence. "Please, Father, take me to him." The crowd was massive, far larger than Eli had anticipated. Hundreds of people pressed forward, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the man from Nazareth. Eli carried Nathaniel on his shoulders while Leah followed closely behind, anxiously scanning the sea of faces. "I can't see him," Eli said, frustration edging his voice. "The crowd is too thick." Nathaniel patted his father's head. "It's all right, Father. Perhaps we can just listen to his words." But Leah was not so easily deterred. "We didn't come just to listen, we came for a miracle." She began pushing forward, creating a narrow path through the throng of people. "Make way. Please, my son is paralyzed. We must reach Jesus." Some turned with irritation at the interruption, but when they saw the small boy on his father's shoulders, their expressions softened. A few even stepped aside, murmuring words of encouragement. Others, however, held their ground, having waited hours for their own chance to see the renowned teacher. "The house," someone nearby mentioned. "He's teaching inside Simon Peter's house now." The crowd outside was too large. Eli's heart sank as they approached the modest dwelling. People were packed so densely around it that not even a child could squeeze through. Some had climbed onto the roof of adjacent buildings to peer through windows. The door was guarded by several stern-looking men who appeared to be Jesus' disciples, turning away all but the most desperate cases. "We'll never get in," Eli sighed, exhaustion from carrying his son and the weight of perpetual disappointment crushing his spirit. "Yes, we will," Leah said with quiet determination. She approached a man who seemed vaguely familiar, Levi, who had once been a tax collector before inexplicably leaving his profitable position to follow Jesus. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "My son has been paralyzed for 3 years. We've tried everything, this is our only hope." Levi's face was sympathetic but firm. "The house is beyond capacity. Perhaps when Jesus comes out, by then the crowd will be even larger," Leah interrupted. "Please look at my boy. One touch from your master could change his entire life." Levi hesitated, then shook his head regretfully. "I'm sorry. Even if I wanted to let you in, there's simply no room. Not even enough space to drop a needle inside." Defeated, they retreated to the edge of the crowd. Nathanael tried to hide his disappointment, but a single tear escaped down his cheek. "It's all right, Mother. Perhaps it wasn't God's will." Eli was about to suggest they return home when he noticed several of his fellow stonemasons in the crowd. An idea, dangerous but desperate, formed in his mind. "I know another way," he said suddenly. "This is madness, Eli," hissed Joram, one of Eli's oldest friends. "Breaking through a roof? We could be arrested." They stood at the back of Simon Peter's house, hidden from the main crowd. Eli had convinced 3 of his fellow craftsmen to help, appealing to their friendship and their faith. "I've repaired dozens of these roofs," Eli replied, his voice low but resolute. "The construction is simple, wooden beams covered with branches, clay and straw. We can open a section and lower Nathanael down directly before Jesus. Then we'll repair it afterward, better than it was before." "And if the owner objects, or the Roman authorities?" asked another mason, nervously glancing around. Eli looked at his son, who was now resting on a makeshift stretcher they had fashioned from a cloak stretched between 2 poles. "For my son, I would face Caesar himself." With practiced efficiency, the men climbed to the roof using a ladder borrowed from a sympathetic neighbor. Working quickly and quietly, they began removing the packed clay and straw. Below them, they could hear Jesus' voice, though the words were indistinct. "We're directly above the main room now," Eli whispered, peering through a small opening they had created. "I can see him. Jesus is sitting, teaching. There are Pharisees and teachers of the law from every village in Galilee, even from Jerusalem and Judea." Leah, who had climbed up after them, clutched Nathanael's hand. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Him?" The boy shook his head, his eyes shining with faith. "No, Mother. I feel peace, as if this is exactly where we're supposed to be." The opening was now large enough. They secured ropes to the stretcher and prepared to lower Nathanael down. Eli knelt beside his son for a final moment. "Whatever happens below," he whispered, "know that I would tear apart every roof in Galilee for you." Nathanael nodded, his small face solemn but unafraid. "I know, Father. I love you." With exquisite care, the men began lowering the stretcher through the hole in the roof. Dust and debris rained down into the room below, causing an immediate halt to Jesus' teaching. Voices rose in confusion and alarm. Inside the house, the sudden appearance of a hole in the ceiling caused a commotion among the gathered crowd. The Pharisees gasped in outrage at the interruption, while Jesus' disciples moved protectively toward their teacher. But Jesus himself, remained seated, his eyes fixed upward with curious expectation. As the small stretcher descended into the room, the crowd fell silent. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that now streamed through the roof opening, illuminating the small figure at the center of this extraordinary scene. When the stretcher finally touched the floor, directly in front of where Jesus sat, Nathanael found himself looking into the kindest eyes he had ever seen. They were neither condemning of the dramatic entrance nor pitying of his condition. They simply saw him, truly saw him, perhaps for the first time since his illness. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the Pharisees, ready with their criticisms and judgments, waited to see what would happen next. Above, through the hole, in the roof, Eli and Leah peered down anxiously, their hearts pounding. Jesus looked up at the worried faces peering through the roof, then back to the paralyzed boy before him. A smile touched his lips, not of amusement but of profound appreciation for the faith that would drive people to such lengths. "Your faith is remarkable," Jesus said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Then, looking directly at Nathanael, he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Pharisees exchanged dark glances, their expressions hardening with disapproval. Eli, watching from above, felt confusion. They had come for healing, not forgiveness. What did sin have to do with his son's paralysis? "Why, does this man speak like this?" One Pharisee whispered loudly to another. "He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus, seemingly aware of their thoughts, turned to face them. "Why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or 'Rise, take up your mat and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He turned back to Nathanael, his eyes filled with compassion and power. "I say to you, rise, pick up your stretcher and go home." For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Nathanael looked at Jesus, his young face reflecting complete trust. Then slowly, the boy moved his legs that had been lifeless for 3 years. He wiggled his toes, bent his knees, and with growing confidence, pushed himself up to a sitting position. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Above, Leah clasped her hand over her mouth to stifle a cry of joy. Eli blinked rapidly, trying to clear the tears that blurred his vision. Nathanael stood. His legs trembled slightly at first, unused to bearing weight, but they held firm. The boy took one step, then another. With each movement, his confidence grew. He bent down, picked up the stretcher that had been his prison for so long, and held it above his head. "I can walk," he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "Father, Mother, I can walk." The room erupted in praise and amazement. "We have never seen anything like this," people exclaimed. "Glory to the God of Israel." The Pharisees remained silent, their faces unreadable as they witnessed a miracle they could neither explain nor deny. Jesus motioned to the ceiling. "Go to your parents," he said gently. "They have moved heaven and earth, or at least a roof, to bring you to me." Their faith is also rewarded today. Nathanael ran through the streets of Capernaum, his legs carrying him with increasing strength and coordination. Behind him, his parents struggled to keep pace, laughing through tears of joy. News of the miracle spread like wildfire through the village, and people poured out of their homes to witness the boy who now danced with the exuberance that only a child freed from suffering can express. That evening, as the setting sun painted the Sea of Galilee in hues of gold and crimson, the family sat together on the shore. Nathanael had spent the day running, jumping, and playing with other children who had once only been distant figures he watched from his window. "Are you tired?" Leah asked, watching her son's face for signs of pain or weakness. Nathanael shook his head, wiggling his toes in the sand with delight. "My legs feel strong, Mother, like they were never sick at all." Eli, who had spent the afternoon repairing Simon Peter's roof as promised, placed an arm around his wife's shoulders. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. "After all this time, all the prayers that seemed unanswered." "They weren't unanswered," Leah said softly. "They were just waiting for today." As darkness fell, they made their way home. The streets were still abuzz with talk of the miracle, and several times they were stopped by neighbors wanting to touch Nathanael or ask him questions about his encounter with Jesus. When they finally reached their small house, Nathanael paused at the threshold, looking at the mat near the window where he had spent so many days watching life pass by. "May I sleep in my bed tonight?" he asked, pointing to the small raised pallet in the corner that had been unused since his illness. "Of course," Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion. Later, as Nathanael slept soundly for the first time in years without pain or discomfort, Eli and Leah sat outside under the canopy of stars. "Do you understand what Jesus meant?" Leah asked. "About forgiving sins? Nathanael is just a child. What sins could he have committed to deserve such suffering?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, remembering the murmurs of the villagers in the early days of Nathanael's illness. Some had whispered that the boy's condition was punishment for some hidden sin in the family. Others suggested it was a test from God. These whispers had driven Eli to work harder, pray more fervently, give more generously to the temple, all in hope of proving their worthiness for healing. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "Jesus wasn't suggesting that Nathanael's paralysis was caused by sin. Perhaps he was addressing a deeper paralysis, the kind that affects us all." "What do you mean?" "For 3 years, I've been angry at God," Eli confessed. "I've gone through the motions of faith, but in my heart I was bitter. I felt abandoned. Today, when Jesus healed our son, he also healed that paralysis in my soul, my inability to trust, to hope, to believe that God still cares about our small lives." Leah leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. When Jesus looked at Nathanael, it was as if he saw all of him, not just his broken body, but his beautiful spirit. And when he looked up at us through that roof, I felt known in a way I've never experienced before. From inside the house came the sound of Nathanael turning over in his sleep, a simple movement that would have been impossible just that morning. The sound brought fresh tears to both parents' eyes. "What will you tell people?" Leah asked. "When they ask about the miracle?" Eli looked up at the star-filled sky, his face reflecting a peace that had been absent for years. "I will tell them that we met a man who has authority not just over paralyzed limbs, but over paralyzed hearts. I will tell them that true healing begins when we're desperate enough to tear open roofs and lower ourselves completely into his presence." In the days that followed, the story of Nathanael's healing spread throughout Galilee and beyond. Skeptics came to see the boy for themselves, only to leave amazed at the complete restoration of his health. The Pharisees continued to debate the meaning and legitimacy of what had occurred. But for Nathanael and his family, theological arguments held little interest. They had experienced something that transcended explanation. They had encountered love powerful enough to restore what was broken, compassion deep enough to reach through suffering, and authority great enough to command even paralyzed limbs to function again. And each night, as Nathanael ran home after a day of playing with friends, something that had once seemed an impossible dream, his laughter echoed through the streets of Capernaum, a living testimony to the day Jesus performed the miracle of healing the paralyzed child in Galilee. Years later, when Nathanael had grown into a man with children of his own, he would often take them to the shore of Galilee at sunset. There, with his feet in the same waters where Jesus once taught, he would tell them the story of a boy, a roof, and a healer whose compassion changed everything. "Remember," he would tell them, his eyes bright with the memory, "no roof is too thick, no crowd too dense, and no condition too hopeless when faith leads the way to Jesus." And his children, though they had heard the story countless times, would listen in wonder, understanding that they owed their very existence to that extraordinary day when heaven touched earth in the small village of Capernaum, and a paralyzed child rose to walk again.